Welcome to SmithWeekly Discussions, an occasional program for our members of SmithWeekly Research. Please note this program is a private discussion and everything contained herein is for entertainment and educational purposes only. With that, we hope you're in a comfortable position, along with your favorite beverage, to enjoy the discussion. We remind our audience to examine our show notes attached to each of our shows to better understand how our program functions. Before we get into our discussion today, we want to say thanks for questions coming from our audience at SmithWeekly, including Adam B., Craig S., Mike P., and Jackie A. On the program today is a returning guest. Mr. Marc Henderson is back with us. Marc is the president and CEO of Laramide Resources. The company is focused on uranium project development in two jurisdictions, Australia with its Westmoreland conventional uranium project in Queensland, and also in the United States with its Crownpoint-Churchrock ISR uranium project in New Mexico. Laramide also has a handful of various stage uranium exploration projects with the Murphy and Sal La Jara Mesa projects. The company is listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange under the symbol LAM and also on the Australian Securities Exchange under the symbol LAM. Mr. Henderson, it's a pleasure to have you back on the podcast.
Yeah, great to be back with you, Andrew.
It's good to have you back for an update, Marc. It's been a while, and why don't we kick it off here? And it's always good to get insights from our guests as how they see the market environment and, of course, sentiment for uranium juniors and, of course, the events in the sector most recently, of course. Yeah, just talk about that as far as how you see current market conditions for uranium juniors, overall market conditions, and, of course, any key items that you're seeing out there that's worth mentioning, Marc.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think the long-term market trend, particularly for energy and uranium in particular, really hasn't changed very much, if at all. If anything, the underlying currents for the medium to long term look better than ever for nuclear. And I would say nuclear's, it started out sort of having a moment, and I think those moments are getting more and more frequent as, different parts of society kind of join in the conversation. And now you're starting to hear about some of the real thought leaders in business and the technology sector and things like that, kind of adding their voices to the fact that, we probably need nuclear going forward societally. And certainly if there's suddenly a brand new driver for energy demand in the Western world, in the G20 type countries, which there hasn't been for a long, long time, to be honest. Electricity demand was pretty flat. So that underlying backdrop is really still positive. We really had a heck of a run, starting a few years ago from where we were at $25 or something on the spot price, where everything was uneconomic. We ran to the place where everything was economic on paper, above 100, and then we had a normal pullback, and I think we're coming probably towards the end of that pullback now. Those things typically happen in the summer just because of the way particularly in the uranium industry, the way the real business works with marketing and what have you, and the utilities really driving the price that matters the most, which is the term price, which is really the price you can look out to over a number of years and probably establishes the economics for the real production companies. So I think you just kind of had a normal pullback. You had a lot of other commodities pull back as well. The broader markets are seemingly very strong, certainly the averages and things like that. I think within the averages, it's a little more noisy. How that all shakes out, who knows? But commodities seem to be back in the conversation as well to some degree. So I think generally speaking, we're all in a pretty good place. And actually from a standpoint of, if you haven't been in the trade before, or you haven't been in energy before, I think this is a pretty good place to start having a good hard look at it. Those fundamentals aren't going away, and really energy drives society. Energy drives economic growth.
Marc, thank you for that. Yeah, good points on the broader view here on things, and interesting market conditions we've had over this period of 2024, of course, well over halfway at this point into 2024. So appreciate the comments there. I'd like to get into some recent news events for the company. First, on the staffing side, I think this is important, Marc. Talk just briefly here about the recent additions to the company, Josh Leftwich and also John Mays.
Yeah, so let me speak about John Mays first. I mean, we were lucky to have John get involved in the company as a new board member, one of our long-serving board members, decided to retire, even though he's very active in business and whatever. He'd been with us a long time. He was a great board member. And we were fortunate to get a gentleman who's got deep technical background. John Mays is particularly in the very specific area that we're doing in the United States, which is ISR mining, since his entire background has been in that, and he had experience, including in going and helping the Kazakhs when they originally got their big production expansion off the ground in that sort of '06 to '08 time window in the last cycle. So he's really an ISR expert, which is, to be honest, in the world and in the United States, there really aren't a whole lot of those. So we're fortunate to have John get involved at the board level. And in terms of filling the role of our U.S. Principal U.S. executive, Josh Leftwich comes to us also with a deep background in uranium, although he'd been out of the sector sort of for best part of 10 years, really. He went and started another career. He's ex-Cameco, so when everything fades down post Fukushima, he went and got another career going in a different direction. But he's sort of saw what was happening, was keen to get off the sidelines and get back in the uranium business. And his particular expertise is sort of permitting and regulatory and social license and that sort of things. And they're all the skill sets that we really need down in the United States. We're kind of in a period of time where we're quite quiet from a standpoint of, technical work and drilling and the kind of things that oftentimes investors get excited about. But once your project gets to a certain quality and a certain size, it doesn't, at some point, it doesn't need to get any bigger or better. And that's kind of really where we are. And so what we have ahead of us in the United States is really trying to get all of our various projects permitted, in particular Churchrock, which just requires one more permit. And so Josh previously worked at Cameco for quite a period of time up in Wyoming, and was involved in the permitting and the regulatory interface there with all the different regulatory agencies. He kind of, because of that, of course, he tends to know everybody in the business. It's a very small industry. Everybody that's actually in this business operationally even tends to know each other in the United States. And so that's obviously very helpful. He also worked at Mestania, which is now called Alta Mesa in Texas. I think he was one of the initial 5 or 10 employees there. So he has a deep background in uranium and will be a great addition for us.
Mark, I think that's good to point towards experienced people who actually are competent in the sector technically, which is obviously the biggest shortfall that this sector has by a long shot amongst the broader problem within the junior natural resource sector as a whole, or the entire extractive industries. So appreciate that. Good to see those folks come on. It's good just overall to see that as you guys enter development mode here. With respect to capital structure, Mark, it's been a while since you've been on the program, so I wanted to get an update on capital structure. Can you go ahead and update us on the current shares outstanding, the cash on hand presently, and how far that gets you down the road, and then also the equity held by management and the board?
Yeah, so overall, we're cap structure. We're at about 250 million shares now, I believe. There's no longer any warrants outstanding. All the warrants from previous issuances were all exercised and brought money in. There's some stock options still out there, but I want to say less than 5%. Well, probably well less than 5%. The cash is now sort of sub 5 million, so we're getting into that runway where we'll be thinking about next steps in terms of capital. But it's more, for us, it's more of a cost of capital issue, to be honest, than an access to capital issue, because we're kind of sensitive to, we're super sensitive to dilution, because the insiders traditionally owned a lot of it. We probably own just shy of 10%. We haven't been particularly, we think we've been lagging a little bit in terms of where our capitalization overall sits. We've had a pretty big pullback in the stock. The highs probably this cycle were probably closer to $1. Now we're sitting in the 50 to 60 cent range. So the market cap now is on the order of sort of 130 to 150 million Canadian, which for the quality of the assets we have and the scale of the assets we have, we think is pretty undervalued. So that's kind of what you're thinking in terms of when you look at how to capitalize going forward. In terms of our capital requirements going forward, because we're not yet in that thing where we can see the start date, the shovel in the ground date, if you will, for a year or two, we sort of have the fairly modest capital requirements for the next couple of years, and so that mitigates the requirement to have tens of millions of dollars around. There will come a time when that we'll be looking at those sort of capital market decisions, but there's a little ways off yet.
Good to get an understanding of how things are set up here so far. I'd like to move into the work ongoing with projects first in Australia, Marc. You guys have a drill campaign at Westmoreland and Murphy projects. Obviously, those are very closely associated, but talk about what the goals are here at these two projects, as well as you guys did just put out some drill results. Talk about that as well.
Sure. Yeah. So we put out this just today, actually. So the timing is it's quite good. We started drilling the seasonal drilling there in that particular part of the world. So we sort of have the reverse summer season. We tend to want to drill in the winter time frame over there, which the window kind of opens up typically maybe as early to mid May and then shuts down probably mid November. We got a little late start this year because of the water conditions on the ground and what have you. So we didn't start till probably the middle of June, latter half of June. But we had a big program plan this year, 2 rigs, 100 plus holes. The goal this year was really to focus for the first time in a long time, really on having a look at the overall scope of the resource potential on the project, try and identify some new targets that could immediately go into the resource base, just because we contemplate that we will ultimately be doing a feasibility study and actually setting the throughput rate for the project when it does ultimately get built. And obviously, the bigger and better you start with, the better it is. So we have some scope for that there because we hadn't included some of the work that had been done previously. And in our previous, when the last boom was on, which is when we acquired this project, because we had acquired it from third parties, we mostly spent most of our time and energy validating what was there already to the dictates of the market that's required. You're required to do a certain amount of your own work, and it has to be done to a certain level of quality. Everything you do in terms of third party attribution, in terms of the metallurgy and the drill spacing and all that sort of stuff. So that dominated most of what we did before, as opposed to looking at the project and going, this is fantastic. How big can it be? How good can it be? And I think we're onto that latter question now. Let's revive the whole thing. Let's go out. We had a lot of low hanging fruit in terms of targets. We had easy places we could go, both to probably expand things a little bit from the known, but also some brand new targets that could be potential satellite type feeders to the plant. Now we're building a typical open cut type mine out in the open in the Australian outback, if you will. And so that lends itself to, if you find other sources of mill feed, it can readily feed into an operation. And so those are the kind of things we're looking at now. And we're having we started really with that a year or two ago, and we've ramped it up every year. This is the biggest year we've had since the uranium markets have come back. We're quite pleased with what we have. We're hitting on all the targets where we expected to be hitting, and we expect to have a very successful campaign and to really showcase the asset once we're done. We plan this year, at the conclusion of this year's program, to actually freshen up the resource overall. The overall resource now is at roughly 50 plus million pounds. It supports a 3.5, 4 million pound a year type operation, which is is basically a top 10 global uranium mine in a very good jurisdiction. So, the idea really now is more just to enhance things, as opposed to, we're looking to do work in order to make everything work. We don't really need to do that. All the previous work we did basically has identified this as a very technically low risk, relatively simple operation that has scale to it. And the scale is really what will attract interest, particularly from utilities and what have you. Because really there aren't that many. You got a lot of assets in the world, but most of the ones that are in the Western world tend to be somewhat smaller. And so if you're a utility, you gotta cobble together a lot of contracts from a lot of places, as opposed to trying to find 4 or 5 of these bigger entities that you can do your contracting with. And I think that's kind of where the market is headed. That's kind of where the market was always headed, given the nature of the business. And I think what you're seeing with this, there's a big takeover bid going on in the space right now, where an Australia company is coming into my backyard in Canada, basically, and taking out one of the bigger known development assets. And that's really all about putting a company together that that has a big footprint within the industry and is a big, prominent, important company for the utilities.
Definitely an interesting project and certainly a good one. And with that, I want to talk schedule here in just a moment, but as you know, the Queensland government seats are up for re-election come late October this year. How is the company preparing for the various outcomes on this political front?
We're waiting to see obviously the actual results. It's been building for some time that this is probably a change election, and that the high probability is that there'll be a change of government. And with a change of government, the policy that prevents our project from getting developed, it leaves the building when those folks currently running the state leave the building. It's kind of not really well understood, the whole history of, uranium and the Australian government, and do they like uranium? What's the three mines policy? All these various things. Now, of course, they're talking, just to confuse matters really badly, they're having a full-blown national debate about energy policy in Australia, and of course, nuclear has come into the mix because one of the two parties very much wants to include nuclear as part of the energy generation mix going forward, as you would if you wanted to create clean energy. And the other party has still got this kind of legacy, 1970s Jackson Browne no nukes concert. We can't have nuclear under any circumstances mentality. Some of them can't even remember why they still have it. So the reasons they don't like nuclear keep changing, but it's just baked into the policy there. And so that's kind of a confusing overprint, but that doesn't really affect the mining part of it. The Australians have been mining all through the last number of decades. And it's just at the state level where these party policies interfere. And for the time periods that these parties are in power, you can't get projects permitted or built. And so we think that era in Queensland is about to end. And once we have certainty with that, we'll be proceeding pretty quickly to build up the team, in the anticipation that we will proceed full speed ahead with the development of the project. The first phase of that is much like what we're doing in the US now, where the first core group of people you need really are mostly permitting related and, government regulatory interface related, as opposed to you got to hire the project managers, that sort of thing, the engineering people and all the rest of it. As I said earlier, the nature of the project is such that this is not a complicated project. This is not multiple shafts and freeze walls and all the stuff that goes on now in projects in Canada, in Saskatchewan. Which are also, they're as people have seen, they're now running realistically into the billions of dollars of capex. This is not that. This is basically a pretty simple open cut mining operation out in the open with easy access, etc. So the nature of what you need in order to, the team or whatever, if you will, that you need in order to build that isn't even as technically specific as you would need with respect to, say, the ISR operation that we're going to try and build in the United States. ISR is a whole different methodology, which requires a completely different expertise to some degree, as opposed to, quote unquote, the mining business. In fact, some people would argue that ISR really isn't even, mining. You're really moving water around. It's a solution mining, if you will. So, so what we're doing there, we will sort of gradually over time build up the team. I think starting obviously with people with deep technical expertise in environmental permitting and that sort of thing, and move on from there. We're probably, because we get asked this question too, is, well, when are you going to freshen up the economics and everything on the project? Since we did a couple of economic studies, PEAs, the second of those was really quite detailed. I wouldn't go as far as say it's PFS, but it had a lot of detail in exactly what we're going to do. And the reality is, if we had to do it today, it would be, the study would look very much the same, because we're going to basically do exactly the same thing. I mean, your capital might change a little bit and that sort of thing, but basically the nature of what you plan to do is not going to change. If you have a particular footprint of where the operation is supposed to be, it's not going to change, et cetera, et cetera. So, and also in terms of providing more of that sort of information to the marketplace, I think if we've learned anything over the last 3 or 4 years, is you don't want to jump the gun too much on that, on providing economic numbers, that then have to be constantly revised. So I think you're well served to wait until you're closer to when you're realistically going to be out financing the project and breaking ground on the project to put real capital numbers out on the project. So the sequence will be, we'll do more on the resource. I would think, notwithstanding that it doesn't need to get bigger or better. I think, we see a lot of potential for it to get bigger and better. So I think we're going to keep exploring. It's not expensive for us to explore in Australia, which is terrific. I mean, we're going to drill 100 plus holes. Is going to cost us probably $4 million or something like that. If you compare that to what it would cost you to explore for uranium in other parts of the world, particularly places like Saskatchewan, you get a lot of bang for the buck there. So I think we're gonna keep doing that, even though as we move towards building the project, and at some point we'll do a revised economic study. The hope would be that we'll probably try and make it either extend the mine life on the project as a result of these incremental resources that we're finding, or we'll make the project bigger from a throughput standpoint, which that's always better, usually economically, but it's also, again, more attractive to the utilities.
Just with speaking of, an outcome that's favorable, let's just assume that things go okay with the election. What do you think would be a realistic time frame to see this construction start? Are we talking 2 years, 3 years, 4 years? I mean, just give us a rough context of what you think would be a reasonable time frame once you guys were able to move forward.
Do you hate to get pigeonholed on that sort of thing with respect to things you don't control at all? And permitting's kind of the one area that you really don't control at all. What I would say though is having not permitted a uranium mine in a long, long time in Queensland, I think if this government gets in, they're going to be pretty determined to make sure that that asset gets permitted in the term that they have available to them. The template for this whole exercise is really, this has already happened, because in Western Australia we had exactly the same dynamic in '09, and everything got permitted. I think by the second term of that administration, everything was permitted, and I think there was a determination to get things permitted. And I think in Queensland that'll be the case. But whether that's 2 years or longer, I can't, I can't really say. We're going to drive it as hard as we can. They did put in place. We had a time window in Queensland from 2012 to 2015 when the other party was in power, and it's really a two-party system, much like you have in the United States with Democrats and Republicans, and typically the parties go back and forth. And the Labour's tended to be in power longer in Queensland for whatever reason than the Liberal Party, which is the right of center party. But they went out of their way to sort of pave the way for people's mind share, if you will, about permitting uranium mine. That they did a whole, not a white paper, but the equivalent of that, basically did a 300-page study about how they would approach the permitting and the regulatory piece and everything else, and published a report on that called the Bell Report back in 2014, I want to say. So they already have the blueprint on the shelf about how to deal with any incremental radioactivity aspects of the project, which is really the only incremental piece you have on a permitting agenda that would differentiate this from the other sorts of mines that they would permit. And Australia's resource powerhouse. They're very, they have a lot of regulatory capacity to permit resource projects because they do it all the time. So that's the one thing I think that really is in our favor, is when you want to permit something in that country, they just tend to get on with it. I mean, if you look at how quickly they stood up a lithium business in Australia, where they are now the number one market share player in the world in that business from nowhere, that speaks to the fact that when they decided they wanted to be in the lithium business, the regulators did not get in the way.
It's interesting. I mean, of course, Australia has done their part with coal, and it's funny. It's a non-reactor country at the moment, at least for commercial purposes. The lithium's okay because it kind of suits the collectively green energy approach. Nothing green about any of it, but anyway, lithium, and then of course, big coal exporter to China. So it's interesting. So yeah, you're right. I mean, if they can get behind uranium, obviously they can get things done. But as you know, there's a quite a countrywide issue with discussing, is the country going to get its first reactor actually done, and all that fun stuff. So it's always an interesting bit listening and watching some of these dynamics, Mark, as you well know, and of course you guys know it well, having to deal with the different jurisdictions as well. And I think we have some comparables as well when you look at Western Australia or Northern Territories as far as permitting times, recent projects that have permits, and those sort of things. So I appreciate you putting a little bit of context around it. I know it's very subjective and it's a moving target, but I do appreciate your comments on how you see the approach there. With respect to the United States here, I'd like to move over and just talk a little bit about the projects in the U.S., New Mexico predominantly here. How about just a quick update on Crownpoint-Churchrock here? First, of course, the company has put out a PEA earlier this year. Talk about the highlights from that PEA, Mark, and then also what you see as the next steps and schedule for this project.
Sure. Well, in terms of the PEA or the overall kind of big picture economics of the project, if you will, we were fortunate we had a big resource there. It's a big legacy resource originally. A lot of it drilled out by a division of General Electric from sort of the tail end of the 1970s. And back in the 70s, for those of you not familiar with how that whole uranium business evolved, I mean, nuclear was everything by the end of the 70s in terms of energy. It was going to be the energy of the future. And so all of the big oil companies were trying to migrate there because they had the same kind of idea that, oil might get stranded or something. And so they all had their uranium divisions. In fact, Crown Point was drilled out by an oil company and that kind of thing. So, what's old is new again. And so we have a project that really, again, we were fortunate to have. We used to own the royalty. Now we own the whole project. And it's large in terms of one coherent project with sort of 50 plus million pounds of resource, and that lends itself to some scale. Now we did a study that basically straight lined the production process over a 30-year period, which realistically probably won't happen. It'll be produced faster than that. But even the economics there with a relatively low denominator work very well. I mean, ISR tends to be, high capex, low opex. In our case, it's not even really high capex because the nature of the capital involved is sort of $50 million to build a process plant, an initial set of well fields, and then you just do sequential well fields. And so it lends itself to being on the on the lowest part of the cost curve. I think it's sub $30 cash cost, and plug in whatever revenue number you want, but there's going to be a very substantial margin there, and then there's obviously opportunity to scale it up. So it's a very commercial project, even with very conservative operating assumptions, as most of the ISRs tend to be, because most of them share the same characteristics that they're relatively low, low capex and low opex. Low opex in particular, because as I said earlier, it's mostly a solution mining thing, and in the United States, for the most part, you're just using dissolved oxygen to remobilize the uranium, and then you're pumping it to surface and extracting the uranium out of it in a relatively simple process plant. And the nature of the metallurgy lends itself to being such that the process plants aren't overly complex. And that's what contributes to relatively low capex in these operating plants compared to, say, for example, trying to extract base metals or even gold. And so, it has a very nice set of economics. It's very well advanced. It has the previous operator had secured a NRC license, a federal license, which is most of the permitting you need. We need one state permit in order to effectively be ready to go, where you would think, okay, this project's ready to build. And that's a discharge permit, where it's really a remediation type permit, because you want to demonstrate that you can remediate the site before they'll give you a discharge permit. So we're in the process of starting down the road to get that permit. We need to do some technical studies to provide the data that backs up that permit. And we're fortunate because we were able to secure a grant from the Department of Energy, because now the US government, and frankly of both political parties, is pretty pro-nuclear across the board. They're actually trying to, and I think they understand the need for domestic security of supply. They're obviously very concerned about the Russian concentration and enrichment, one of the steps in the nuclear fuel cycle. And so we're engaged now in that permit, and we're doing the lab work we need to do to support that at Los Alamos Labs, which people are probably familiar with. It's kind of the epicenter of nuclear technology expertise in America. And so we think that should hopefully facilitate the whole permitting exercise. But it's a thing that's going to take a year or two to get that project to where it's quote unquote shovel ready. And in the meantime, because there really isn't a lot of upside in doing a whole lot of technical work on the project, particularly until you get closer to the final permit, it's probably going to be kind of news flow light out of that particular asset. But the caliber of the asset is what it is, and it's a very large, very economic ISR deposit.
It's a good project overall, and obviously there's a few more things left to do here, but appreciate the update on where that stands and how you guys plan to advance that in parallel with Westmoreland and of course Murphy and all the other projects that you guys are working on. There's lots to do on the table. With respect to the project and the NRC license that was granted, what would be the plan there as far as renewal of that license? Where would that fall in, or is that something that would happen before the project kicks off on construction, or how do you see that slotting in as far as the renewal of that license?
There's a parallel renewal process that's sort of going on with that too, quietly in the background. So there'll be an NRC license renewal application that goes in sometime in the next probably 6 or 8 months. The new regime there is that you get a 20-year license, 20-year renewal. They've been giving us 5-year renewal extensions for the longest time, well, even before we owned the project, because the permitting is relatively old on that project now. But we don't expect any difficulty because we're not asking to do anything they haven't permitted already. And then obviously you can always go and ask for amendments once you have a license and that sort of thing. And I think in the long term, the big potential in New Mexico, beyond what we already know about in terms of, okay, we have a NRC license that allows us to build a particular process plant in a particular place with a specific capacity, 3 million pounds a year. And so obviously, again, that's another thing that if you wanted to get additional capacity, you'd have to go through a renewal update process or whatever to do that. But the big potential I would say in the US is probably New Mexico, maybe secondarily Wyoming, and then in third place would be probably Texas in terms of scale of if there were no impediments other than geology to how much uranium production can we get in America for security of supply reasons. Can we get back to 15 or 20 million pounds per annum like we used to do in the 70s? That would be your pecking order where you would apply capital, because that's where the best remaining to develop resources are.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, New Mexico, if we could get past a little bit of the political hurdles and the community hurdles there, it would certainly be a place that would be very, very much desirable, and certainly has, from a resource standpoint, a fantastic endowment, Mark, as you well know. So I appreciate the comments on that. So with that, of course, you guys are doing additional work as well over at LaSalle and the La Jara projects. Talk a little bit about what activities you guys have going on those projects.
Well, on LaSalle, which is a smallish high grade deposit that was developed by Homestake Mining, who was a big uranium producer historically, and they developed LaSalle 1. This was LaSalle 2 that was ready for production and just never got into production because the whole uranium business stopped abruptly in the early 1980s. And that's why a lot of these legacy projects are out there, to be honest. Like this whole legacy endowment of resource would have been gone by now, but for the fact that in a way uranium was, or nuclear was too successful. So you built 100 plants in the 70s in 10 years or something. And you went from an energy, oh my God, there's an energy crisis, because that was the decade of the two oil price spikes, and everybody scrambling and trying to figure out what the energy future looked like, and nuclear basically took electricity generation from a deficit to a big surplus, and that's what shut the whole uranium business down, because it was kind of too successful, and they didn't need to build any more nuclear plants because they'd satisfied all the electricity demand. And so these projects kind of were left, and some of them in very good position, and particularly this LaSalle position. I mean, they'd driven an adit right to the face of the ore body, and then, okay, well, we got to put it on care and maintenance. no one expects it to be on care and maintenance 40 years later, but there you have it. And so this project's kind of ready to go, needs relatively modest capital, and can feed the blanding plant of EFR, which is the only hard rock mill in the United States, which gives it obviously big strategic value, et cetera. But it depends on what Energy Fuels wants to do in terms of their whole production approach, scale, what have you, to the uranium business, because they've got mines of their own, that sort of thing. But at some point, this will be a natural feeder for that, and we're just kind of waiting. We're keeping the permits in good standing there. We basically have a permit to start with a bulk sample, and then that would morph into more of an operating permit. The other asset, La Jara Mesa, which is also a homestake asset, again found after the 70s boom was over, was found in the 82, 83, I believe. And it's a bit bigger and has more, has the capacity to grow the resource a bit. It's 10 million sort of pounds now. And again, that can go to blanding. It's a lot further away, but it's good grade, and it's a natural feeder. We're in the process of finishing the permitting we started in the last cycle on that one. We'd gotten a long way down the road. We had an EIS basically filed, and it just never got finally signed off on. So we're basically finishing the permitting. We have to do certain sections of it over, but that's a thing we're just going to plug away at. Again, it's more time than money, and then we just want to be in a position where you are in a position to move if you get a uranium market that makes that a very attractive proposition. I mean, you have had periods of time in the United States where domestic production was effectively subsidized. Whether you get that again or not, who knows? But we have these projects, and they're some of the better projects economically, and so you just want to get them ready and be ready to go, and then in anticipation that at some point they're probably going to be required.
Yeah, it looks like, Mark, on this, that these projects potentially have the quickest pathway towards production and potential small cash flow for the company, just given their status, and then also the other projects, potential lead times that you have that might exceed what you have going here. So it can certainly make some sense to take a look at these projects and potentially get those things moving forward. So I appreciate the comments on those two projects and their importance. You have pipeline for sure, but you have some different stage projects on the schedule that fit in here quite well. And then of course there'll be some creative ways as the market matures out here and we get into later stages of the cycle. We'll see a lot of those creative ways that have been done historically probably come back into this sector before it's over, as far as utility involvement, government involvement, and the various other avenues here to move some of these projects forward. If the policy remains with action that the United States wants to return to being a reasonably respected uranium producer and also fuel cycle jurisdiction, which obviously is lacking terribly in both of those categories. So we'll see what happens here over the next, call it 5 to 10 years, to see if it can regain that position and if it truly is trying to go in that direction. So looking forward to seeing that. On local community, Mark, you've got government relations, but you also have to deal with essentially three different local community folks at these different jurisdictions. Just talk about some of the work you guys are doing to advance those relationships with each of the local communities in the respective jurisdictions, maybe just the core projects here, New Mexico, Queensland, and then how you're obtaining that social acceptance and alignment to get these projects moving forward down the right path.
Well, let's start with Australia. In Australia, we were fortunate because the nature of it's not licensing, but the nature of your regulatory process in terms of even working on projects that are in traditional territory, you really require an Aboriginal consulting agreement before you even start. And so we were fortunate. We got that relatively smoothly. We have groups there that really support the whole idea of nuclear and the mining business generally. And so we subsequently signed a more advanced agreement, and there'll be a subsequent yet to happen when it finally goes into production. So we have a very good rapport there. And I would say in Australia also, it's a different, because we're familiar with Canada too, because I live in Canada and have been involved in other commodities and stuff and been permitting things here. And so that the Aboriginal or the traditional owner, First Nation, whatever nomenclature you want to use, they're different in all these different jurisdictions. But what you don't have in Canada and in Australia is less of this third party advocacy groups, call it what you will, where that really somehow or other they get aligned with the traditional owners, and the opposition to why they're in opposition to things tends to get blurred. And on top of that, you layer over the tort lawyer business in the United States, um, and your pathway can be much more challenging, I would say now, and I would say Canada's gotten very challenging for that reason too. In the United States, you have an extra layer of it where there's some advocacy group that is going, if you get a permit on anything in the United States, and it's not just uranium, let's say copper or whatever it is, you are going to have, the government is going to grant you the permit. The regulatory people do a very good job, and they're very capable, and their project or their permitting approvals are usually technically bulletproof because they know they have to be, because the government knows that it's going to get sued by somebody when they give anybody a permit. That's just the way it goes. And so that is a completely different landscape than you have in Australia. And so going back to my earlier comment about how did the Australians blow by everybody in the lithium business, because they don't have that. And they're still trying to permit a couple of lithium things in Nevada, and they have the full support of the current administration, which is trying to shower them with billions of dollars of loan guarantees. And they missed the window. I mean, the lithium market came and went, and they haven't broken ground. So U.S. is challenging. Yeah. So you have to just grind away at it. I mean, and the social license part with communities is just one part of it. And any mining project anywhere in the world now, no one's going to get approval for anything without you doing appropriate amount of social license activity and have buy-in from. It starts with buy-in from locals. In these other jurisdictions, the circle of buy-in that you require to get projects off the ground now, it just gets wider and wider. I would say it's wider still in Canada, and now in the United States, it's, you basically have to, you won't ever get, I guess the way to look at it is you won't ever get universal buy-in in the United States, typically. That's my view. You just have to understand this is the way the process works, and if you're determined, you'll get to the finish line.
It is quite a challenge on these different jurisdictions. And of course, the way the political winds blow, right? And what commodities are in favor by the government and what commodities are not in favor. Obviously, we've seen that play out time and time again in the US, and difficulties, as you know, even getting a ISR copper mine permitted in Arizona can be quite difficult, as you well know, Mark. And just with respect to the New Mexico assets, any comments there with respect to relationships with the tribes in New Mexico?
The relationship between the project and in particular the Navajo there has been, over a long period of time, was quite adversarial. It was litigated and all the rest of it. And in that case, there are much more local specific issues and sovereignty type issues, because the tribal groups, if they have sovereignty, are always trying to, they never want to have lesser sovereignty. So there's always that question that's around everything. And that was part of the whole background to that. There's a legitimate legacy issue around all these historical uranium mines that have left some kind of footprint that people are still concerned about that in particular. And there's all kinds of legislation and money and all kinds of things we can put aside for that, but it's not been quote unquote cleaned up to anybody's satisfaction yet. When that'll be, who knows? We're going to try and do our, obviously do our part as part of that. And I think you need active, profitable businesses in order to pay their share of that, presumably. So there is a little bit of an overprint on that. The new factor in all this is there's no history whatsoever of ISR mining in New Mexico. And ISR production is not what caused any of the previous issues. And by the way, most of the previous production in New Mexico, or a lot of the previous production, particularly the first wave, was all done at the behest of the US government. So the liable party in a lot of that stuff is the federal government to some degree, in a lot of cases to a large degree. So you've got a lot of complicating factors in all that relationship, all of that history, etc. Now we are going to do a much more going forward in terms of trying to have a direct social license undertaking, interface, etc., with all the local groups than has been in the past, because we've kind of been, we bought this project. for years you couldn't do anything with it because of the price. We're only now starting to really kind of move ahead on it in any kind of a meaningful way. And so that'll all now evolve, but it'll be an important component of the next steps in the next couple of years as we work through the whole permitting process. Part of the whole thing is also, and I think part of the reason that it's good to have this test work being done at a very high level is because in the United States, particularly in the Western United States, one of the huge issues is water. You have a lot of water issues where you have contamination issues that have nothing to do with any actual human related activity, but you need to understand what you can do to mitigate a lot of that. And so part of the work that we're doing now is really related to that and related to aquifer restoration and that sort of thing, which has a broader application to the Western United States. Because one of the things that this test work is designed to do is to use less water in the restoration process. Because right now the solution in a lot of these ISR deposits is just to, you just put a certain amount of pore volumes through until the water gets back to a state where it's deemed to be acceptable. But you're using fresh water, which is a scarce resource.
Good points there, and looking forward to seeing you guys advance the work on the project and also getting that community alignment and all the things that go into that as well, Mark. So I appreciate the comments on that bit. Mark, just staying in the U.S. or even we can move into Australia or just sector wide here, really. Any comments, Mark, on your view of recent mergers and acquisitions in the uranium sector and how you see M&A playing a role going forward in the sector?
Well, it's a very small pool of players, if you will, in that M&A game because you're mostly for the most part, you're talking about developers, which is, I mean, the pressure is really on now to get some new supply into the marketplace. So for the most part, you're going to look first to the folks like ourselves that have late stage projects that can be built, just add money and permits and build these things in some kind of ordinary logical sequence, right? And you would think the ordinary logical sequence would be they would be built based on where they would rank in their economic attractiveness, where they sit on the cost curve sort of thing. Now, in uranium, that may not be the case. And part of the reason that may not be the case is because it's a contractual business and the utilities, for the most part, they're not price inelastic, or price agnostic, but first and foremost, they need these pounds when they need these pounds, and they need them year in, year out. They also don't need all these pounds in 1 or 2 year window. And so you got all these companies fighting to get into this tiny little window where they're suddenly we're going to supposedly have a deficit, but in reality we're going to have a deficit over a longer period of time, and we need to sort of see, okay, how are you going to make it through the 2030s, for example? And so I can see a scenario now where, because of what's happened with the way the business has come out of the bear market, you're slowly getting back to a market where newly mined supply will, meet demand, but the demand is now running away from you again because of restarts and things like that. Not restarts, but you're getting reactor extensions and things like that. So, we're going to be at a demand place where we're going to need well over 200 million pounds. I don't know what the supply number is now, but it's 130 or 140. I'd be surprised. So there's a big amount of pounds that's going to be required now and growing all the time. And we've had the easy stuff has started now. Like the people that had projects that were on, the reason that these restarts went first is because they had, most of them, they had permits, and in some cases they just stopped, and now they're starting back up again. And so by and large, those things have been done and they're happening, and how successful they are, I guess we're going to find out in the next 12 or 18 months. And now you're into the next wave of things. And you were talking a little earlier about timeline, because everybody's thinking, oh, how fast can you be on and everything else? Well, with what's left of the suite of projects that's really left, you're into things now that realistically can't start for at least 2 years, 3 years, maybe some of these Namibian things where they actually have the permits, but now you got to go build it, you got to raise the money. And after that, you're into the deep Saskatchewan things that take a long, long time because you have to sink shafts. And so where our projects sit are not too differently, frankly, than most of everybody else, even though we don't have full permits on anything yet. And I think the one deal that's in the marketplace that is, I think, indicative of where the whole space is headed is this Paladin bid for Fission, because they're going to create a company that has a big production profile. The utilities are going to look at that and think this is a big, interesting thing that we can do a lot of business with. They're going to have production of well above 10 million pounds. You know, Cameco, from their own assets, never really got beyond, to their own account, never really got much beyond 20 million pounds. Kazatomprom's obviously bigger, but that's a whole different question about where those pounds are going to go and who they're available to and who, and in a lot of cases they're spoken for, because if they have JVs, they're, you know, they have a JV with a Korean utility, the pounds are going to Korea. And so you're down to this, what's available in the West and how fast can it come on and everything else. So I think this Paladin Fission thing is really kind of a template for, I think, what the M&A is going to look like, because I think other people are going to quickly try and assemble companies that look something like that, because that's where the longer term capital in the business is going to want to migrate to. They're going to want to migrate to companies that are going to become real operating companies with scale. And the scale is important to the buyer. Like this business doesn't exist investors or ETFs or anything. It exists for the utilities. And whether we like it or not, I mean, there's sort of this tension between historically, right? Because there's no love lost between the utilities and the producers. And, you know, for the most of the history of civilian nuclear power, I think the producers feel like the utilities have been having their way. But at the end of the day, they're the customers. And so, and you can build a very nice business on the back of being a high quality supplier to the utilities. And I think that's probably where the M&A thing is inevitably gonna go. The other thing that I think hasn't played out yet, and I've thought this for a while, is we really are going to have some kind of an exploration market, because it's going to become obvious that once we know where all this currently known development resource in the world is going, and it's spoken for, and it's actually starting to happen, they're going to look beyond that and go, well, okay, that's great. What do we do in 2040, 2041? You know, you turn on a nuclear power plant today in China, you need 60 years of fuel for it. You know, I don't know what the global resource base is of uranium, but it isn't 60 years. I can tell you that. It's probably way less than 20, and might be worse than that. And we're going to get hopefully a big tell soon out of Kazatomprom, because that's the number everybody's waiting for, and no one really knows what's going on there. But one of the lines of thought is that I think they've had to recalibrate, you know, their long-term endowment and how they're going to extract that endowment to the benefit of the country and all the rest of it, vis-a-vis the resource base, because the resource base hasn't really grown. I mean, the resource base was discovered in the 80s for the most part, and so I think you're going to see an effort to enhance exploration effort all over the place, and probably beyond places where we know already, because we sort of don't need to find any more stuff in Saskatchewan, because there's a lot of pounds there already. And now it's about how are you going to get those pounds to market? In some sense, you sort of need to find some easier, short life type pounds. You need to find pounds that are like shale oil pounds, where you can turn them on quickly, I think. I mean, yeah, that could be an element of the story that hasn't really developed yet. And, you know, we haven't seen a big, exciting new discovery outside of these few known places that people get excited about, particularly in Canada, because you are capable of making a discovery there. I mean, the Alligator Rivers, I would say one of the best places in the world is the Alligator Rivers area of Australia, which, you know, people have been going there, and big companies have been going there, including Cameco and Heavy, for a long, long time, because geologically it's where you would go. It's exciting and you can make a big discovery. And so that's had some traction, but the Australian government recently shot themselves in the foot. They're taking Jabiluka and Ranger Deeps, which are 400 million pounds of easy known uranium that could be available to the world, and they're trying to sterilize it. That's not going to make things any easier for the utilities.
It's a real pickle out there for sure, Mark, all these various jurisdictions, and how this gap gets filled out in any meaningful time frame and at any decent numbers, given what we've seen recently with some of the attempts that everything is severely challenged across the board. I don't know that there's been any perfect execution to date. Certainly some folks that have tried hard and have some success, but there has been no perfect execution. And so if that's any indication of what's to come, I think we have a pretty good idea of how it's looking here just over the last 2 years of watching execution, 3 years of watching execution, whether it's the majors, whether it's the juniors. So looking forward to seeing the next event here to help propel this forward. I do think we're in a very good position here, and looking forward to seeing the next 24 months would be quite interesting, aside from all the interesting things that happen outside of this market that does impact it, as you and I have both seen as well. So appreciate the thoughts there. Well, Marc, just for the sake of time, we'll leave it there for now. I know we could probably chat on a few more things here, but wrap up with this and any final comments that you have for potential investors who are listening in. The company has a market capitalization of about 130 million Canadian dollars. Why should Laramide Resources be considered within the institutional, family office, and retail investors portfolio at this stage?
Well, I mean, I think if you're looking for outsized returns, the valuation of our company relative to the asset base has kind of been suppressed because of these political things, in particular Australia. I mean, I think the valuation and the way the analyst community values development assets, typically they try and do a NAV calculation, and then you get some percentage of NAV typically going forward until you get closer to where they can start putting production numbers in and EPS type numbers in. And so we don't benefit really from any of that because I think a lot of the framework has been that we're just going to value this at zero or close to zero or some kind of far dated option until we get more certainty. And so, well, you're 8 weeks away from having pretty good certainty that shouldn't be valued that way anymore. And the reval is not small, So if you take other things that can produce 4 to 5 million pounds a year at the lowest quartile of the cost curve and value them with what the marketplace would pay for them, there's a lot of room.
Marc, what is the best way for interested parties to reach out to the company?
Oh, just email me directly, mark@laramide.com. I love talking to shareholders. Building a register of real owners is one of the most important jobs I think you can do as CEO, right? So we love to talk to people that are long-term holders and understand the sort of long-term game plan. And we think it's a pretty good time. I mean, nuclear's got a long runway here, and I've been in this a long time. This is the best I've ever seen it in terms of the economic setup, but just the acceptance of the fact that nuclear is important and is going to be important going forward. I think it gives you a lot of runway, and that the supply side of the business needs to get bigger. It needs to get bigger. It needs to get more responsive. You're going to have to have higher. You're going to have higher prices in order to make that happen. So your short-term players all benefit because we're going to have another price response at some point, probably in the not too distant future. Because this $80 price, I mean, that's not going to get it done.
Well, Marc, look, thank you for coming back on the program to update on the company. Best of luck in the coming months on the drill results. And of course, we do look forward to having you back soon.
Yeah, no, appreciate it, Andrew. Thanks. Always good to chat.